Chapter 10. Traveling in Iceland. It ought, one would have thought, to have been night, even in the 65th parallel of latitude. But still, the nocturnal illumination did not surprise me. For in Iceland, during the months of June and July, the sun never sets. The temperature, however, was very much lower than I expected. I was cold, but even that did not affect me so much as ravenous hunger. Welcome indeed, therefore, was the hut, which hospitably opened its door to us. It was merely the house of a peasant, but in the matter of hospitality, it was worthy of being the palace of a king. As we alighted at the door, the master of the house came forward, held out his hand, and without any further ceremony, signaled to us to follow him. We followed him, for to accompany him was impossible. A long, narrow, gloomy passage led into the interior of this habitation, made from beams roughly squared by the axe. This passage gave ingress to every room. The chambers were four in number: the kitchen, the workshop, where the weaving was carried on, the general sleeping chamber of the family, and the best room, to which strangers were especially invited. My uncle, whose lofty stature had not been taken into consideration when the house was built, contrived to knock his head against the beams of the roof. We were introduced into our chamber, a kind of large room with a hard earthen floor, and lighted by a window, the panes of which were made of a sort of parchment from the intestines of sheep, very far from transparent. The bedding was composed of dry hay thrown into two long red wooden boxes, ornamented with sentences painted in Icelandic. I really had no idea that we should be made so comfortable. There was one objection to the house, and that was the very powerful odor of dried fish and macerated meat and of sour milk, which three fragrances combined did not at all suit my olfactory nerves. As soon as we have freed ourselves from our heavy traveling costume, the voice of our host was heard calling to us to come to the kitchen, the only room in which the Icelanders ever make any fire, no matter how cold it may be. My uncle, nothing loath, hastened to obey this hospitable and friendly invitation. I followed. The kitchen chimney was made on an antique model. A large stone standing in the middle of the room was the fireplace. Above, in the roof, was a hole for the smoke to pass through. This apartment was kitchen, parlor, and dining room, all in one. On our entrance, our worthy host, as if he had not seen us before, advanced ceremoniously, uttered a word which means "be happy," and then kissed both of us on the cheek. His wife followed, pronounced the same word with the same ceremonial. Then the husband and wife, placing their right hands upon their hearts, bowed profoundly. This excellent Icelandic woman was the mother of 19 children, who, little and big, rolled, crawled, and walked about in the midst of volumes of smoke arising from the angular fireplace in the middle of the room. Every now and then I could see a fresh white head and a slightly melancholy expression of countenance peering at me through the vapor. Both my uncle and myself, however, were very friendly with the whole party. And before we were aware of it, there were three or four of these little ones on our shoulders, as many on our boxes, and the rest hanging about our legs. Those who could speak kept crying out Salvartu in every possible and impossible key. Those who did not speak only made all the more noise. This concert was interrupted by the announcement of supper. At this moment, our worthy guide, the Ida duck hunter, came in after seeing to the feeding and stabling of the horses. which consisted in letting them loose to browse on the stunted green of the Icelandic prairies. There was little for them to eat but moss and some very dry, innutritious grass. The next day they were ready before the door, sometime before we were. Welcome, said Hans. Then, tranquilly, with the air of an automaton, without any more expression in one kiss than another, he embraced the host and hostess and their 19 children. This ceremony concluded to the satisfaction of all parties. We all sat down to table, that is, 24 of us, somewhat crowded. Those who were best off had only two juveniles on their knees. As soon, however, as the inevitable soup was placed on the table, the natural taciturnity, common even to Icelandic babies, prevailed over all else. Our host filled our plates with a portion of lichen soup of Icelandic moss, of by no means disagreeable flavor, an enormous lump of fish floating in sour butter. After that, there came some skyr, a kind of curds and whey, served with biscuits and juniper berry juice. To drink, we had blanda, skimmed milk with water. I was hungry, so hungry that by way of dessert, I finished up with a basin of thick oaten porridge. As soon as the meal was over, the children disappeared, whilst the grown people sat around the fireplace, on which was placed turf, heather, cow dung, and dried fish bones. As soon as everybody was sufficiently warm, a general dispersion took place, all retiring to their respective couches. Our hostess offered to pull off our stockings and trousers, according to the custom of the country, but as we graciously declined to be so honored, she left us to our bed of dry fodder. Next day, at 5 in the morning, we took our leave of these hospitable peasants. My uncle had great difficulty in making them accept a sufficient and proper remuneration. Hans then gave the signal to start. We had scarcely got 100 yards from Gardar when the character of the country changed. The soil began to be marshy and boggy, and less favorable to progress. To the right, the range of mountains was prolonged indefinitely, like a great system of natural fortifications, of which we skirted the glacis. We met with numerous streams and rivulets which it was necessary to ford, and that without wetting our baggage. As we advanced, the deserted appearance increased, and yet now and then we could see human shadows flitting in the distance. When a sudden turn of the track brought us within easy reach of one of these specters, I felt a sudden impulse of disgust at the sight of a swollen head, with shining skin, utterly without hair, and whose repulsive and revolting wounds could be seen through his rags. The unhappy wretches never came forward to beg. On the contrary, they ran away. Not so quick, however, but that Hans was able to salute them with the universal salvertu. Spettelsk, said he. A leper, explained my uncle. The very sound of such a word caused a feeling of repulsion. The horrible affliction known as leprosy, which has almost vanished before the effects of modern science, is common in Iceland. It is not contagious, but hereditary, so that marriage is strictly prohibited to these unfortunate creatures. These poor lepers did not tend to enliven our journey, the scene of which was inexpressibly sad and lonely. The very last tufts of grassy vegetation appeared to die at our feet. Not a tree was to be seen, except a few stunted willows about as big as a blackberry bush. Now and then we watched a falcon soaring in the gray and misty air, taking his flight towards warmer and sunnier regions. I could not help feeling a sense of melancholy come over me. I sighed for my own native land and wished to be back with Gretchen. We were compelled to cross several little fjords and at last came to a real gulf. The tide was at its height, and we were able to go over at once and reach the hamlet of Alftanes, about a mile farther. That evening, after fording the Alpha and the Heta, two rivers rich in trout and pike, we were compelled to pass the night in a deserted house, worthy of being haunted by all the fays of Scandinavian mythology. The King of Cold had taken up his residence there and made us feel his presence all night. The following day was remarkable by its lack of any particular incidents. Always the same damp and swampy soil, the same dreary uniformity, the same sad and monotonous aspect of scenery. In the evening, having accomplished the half of our projected journey, we slept at the annexia of Crossbolt. For a whole mile, we had under our feet nothing but lava. This disposition of the soil is called ground. The crumbled lava on the surface was in some instances like ship cables, stretched out horizontally. In others, coiled up in heaps. An immense field of lava came from the neighboring mountains, all extinct volcanoes, but whose remains showed what once they had been. Here and there could be made out the steam from hot water springs. There was no time, however, for us to make more than a cursory view of these phenomena. We had to go forward with what speed we might. Soon the soft and swampy soil again appeared under the feet of our horses, while at every 100 yards we came upon one or more small lakes. Our journey was now in a westerly direction. We had in fact swept round the great bay of Faxa, and the twin white summits of Sneffels rose to the clouds at a distance of less than 5 miles. The horses now advanced rapidly. The accidents and difficulties of the soil no longer checked them. I confess that fatigue began to tell severely upon me, but my uncle was as firm and as hard as he had been on the first day. I could not help admiring both the excellent professor and the worthy guide, for they appeared to regard this rugged expedition as a mere walk. On Saturday, the 20th of June, at 6 o'clock in the evening, we reached Budir, a small town picturesquely situated on the shore of the ocean. And here the guide asked for his money. My uncle settled with him immediately. It was now the family of Hans himself, that is to say, his uncles, his cousins, German, who offered us hospitality. We were exceedingly well received, and without taking too much advantage of the goodness of these worthy people, I should have liked very much to have rested with them after the fatigues of the journey. But my uncle, who did not require rest, had no idea of anything of the kind, and despite the fact that the next day was Sunday, I was compelled once more to mount my steed. The soil was again affected by the neighborhood of the mountains, whose granite peered out of the ground like tops of an old oak. We were skirting the enormous base of the mighty volcano. My uncle never took his eyes from off it. He could not keep from gesticulating and looking at it with a kind of sullen defiance, as much as to say, "That is the giant I have made up my mind to conquer." After 4 hours of steady traveling, the horses stopped of themselves before the door of Presbytery of Stapi. Chapter 11. We reach Mount Sneffels, the Reykir. Stapi is a town consisting of 30 huts, built on a large plain of lava, exposed to the rays of the sun, reflected from the volcano. It stretches its humble tenements along the end of a little fjord, surrounded by a basaltic wall of the most singular character. Basalt is a brown rock of igneous origin. It assumes regular forms, which astonish by their singular appearance. Here we found nature proceeding geometrically and working quite after a human fashion, as if she had employed the plummet line, the compass, and the rule. If elsewhere she produces grand artistic effects by piling up huge masses without order or connection, if elsewhere we see truncated cones, imperfect pyramids, with an odd succession of lines, here, as if wishing to give a lesson in regularity, and preceding the architects of the early ages, she has erected a severe order of architecture, which neither the splendors of Babylon nor the marvels of Greece ever surpassed. I had often heard of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, and of Fingal's Cave in one of the Hebrides, but the grand spectacle of a real basaltic formation had never yet come before my eyes. This at Stapi gave us an idea of one in all its wonderful beauty and grace. The wall of the fjord, like nearly the whole of the peninsula, consisted of a series of vertical columns, in height about 30 feet. These upright pillars of stone of the finest proportions supported an archivolt of horizontal columns which formed a kind of half vaulted roof above the sea. At certain intervals and below this natural basin, the eye was pleased and surprised by the sight of oval openings through which the outward waves came thundering in volleys of foam. Some banks of basalt, torn from their fastenings by the fury of the waves, lay scattered on the ground like the ruins of an ancient temple, ruins eternally young, over which the storms of ages swept without producing any perceptible effect. This was the last stage of our journey. Hans had brought us along with fidelity and intelligence, and I began to feel somewhat more comfortable when I reflected that he was to accompany us still farther on our way. When we halted before the house of the rector, a small and incommodious cabin, neither handsome nor more comfortable than those of his neighbors, I saw a man in the act of shoeing a horse, a hammer in his hand, and a leathern apron tied around his waist. "Be happy," said the eider-down hunter, using his national salutation in his own language. "Good dag, good day," replied the former in excellent Danish. "Kerkorherd," cried Hans, turning round and introducing him to my uncle. "Director," repeated the worthy professor. "It appears, my dear Harry, that this worthy man is the rector, and is not above doing his own work." During the speaking of these words, the guide intimated to the Kirkhoard what was the true state of the case. The good man, ceasing from his occupation, gave a kind of halloo, upon which a tall woman, almost a giantess, came out of the hut. She was at least 6 feet high, which in that region is something considerable. My first impression was one of horror. I thought she had come to give us the Icelandic kiss. I had, however, nothing to fear, for she did not even show much inclination to receive us into her house. The room devoted to strangers appeared to me to be by far the worst in the presbytery. It was narrow, dirty, and offensive. There was, however, no choice about the matter. The rector had no notion of practicing the usual cordial and antique hospitality. Far from it. Before the day was over, I found we had to deal with a blacksmith, a fisherman, a hunter, a carpenter, anything but a clergyman. It must be said in his favor that we have caught him on a weekday. Probably he appeared to greater advantage on a Sunday. These poor priests receive from the Danish government a most ridiculously inadequate salary and collect 1/4 of the tithe of their parish, not more than 60 marks current, or about 10 cents sterling. Hence the necessity of working to live. In truth, we soon found that our host did not count civility among the cardinal virtues. My uncle soon became aware of the kind of man he had to deal with. Instead of a worthy and learned scholar, he found a dull, ill mannered peasant. He therefore resolved to start on his great expedition as soon as possible. He did not care about fatigue and resolved to spend a few days in the mountains. The preparations for our departures were made the very next day after our arrival at Stapi. Hans now hired 3 Icelanders to take the place of the horses, which could no longer carry our luggage. When, however, these worthy islanders had reached the bottom of the crater, they were to go back and leave us to ourselves. This point was settled before they would agree to start. On this occasion, my uncle partly confided in Hans, the eider duck hunter, and gave him to understand that it was his intention to continue his exploration of the volcano to the last possible limits. Hans listened calmly and then nodded his head. To go there, or elsewhere, to bury himself in the bowels of the earth, or to travel over its summits, was all the same to him. As for me, amused and occupied by the incidents of travel, I had begun to forget the inevitable future. But now I was once more destined to realize the actual state of affairs. What was to be done? Run away? But if I really had intended to leave Professor Hardwigg to his fate, it should have been at Hamburg, and not at the foot of Sneffels. One idea above all others began to trouble me, a very terrible idea, and one calculated to shake the nerves of a man even less sensitive than myself. Let us consider the matter, I said to myself. We are going to ascend to Sneffels Mountain. Well and good. We are about to pay a visit to the very bottom of the crater. Good still. Others have done it and did not perish from that course. That, however, is not the whole matter to be considered. If a road does really present itself by which to descend into the dark and subterraneous bowels of Mother Earth, if this thrice unhappy Saknussemm has really told the truth, we shall be most certainly lost in the midst of the labyrinth of subterraneous galleries of the volcano. Now we have no evidence to prove that Sneffels is really extinct. What proof have we that an eruption is not shortly about to take place? Because the monster has slept soundly since 1219. Does it follow that he is never going to wake? If he does wake, what is to become of us? These were questions worth thinking about, and upon them I reflected long and deeply. I could not lie down in search of sleep without dreaming of eruptions. The more I thought, the more I objected to be reduced to the state of dross and ashes. I could stand it no longer, so I determined at last to submit the whole case to my uncle in the most adroit manner possible, and under the form of some totally irreconcilable hypothesis. I sought him. I laid before him my fears, and then drew back in order to let him get his passion over at his ease. I have been thinking about the matter, he said, in the quietest tone in the world. What did he mean? Was he at last about to listen to the voice of reason? Did he think of suspending his project? It was almost too much happiness to be true. I, however, made no remark. In fact, I was only too anxious not to interrupt him and allowed him to reflect at his leisure. After some moments, he spoke out. I have been thinking about the matter, he resumed. Ever since we have been at Stapi, my mind has been almost solely occupied with the grave question which has been submitted to me by yourself. For nothing would be unwiser and more inconsistent than to act with imprudence. I hardly agree with you, my dear uncle, was my somewhat hopeful rejoinder. It is now 600 years since Nephils has spoken. But though now reduced to a state of utter silence, he may speak again. New volcanic eruptions are always preceded by perfectly well known phenomena. I have closely examined the inhabitants of this region. I have carefully studied the soil, and I beg to tell you emphatically, my dear Harry, that there will be no eruptions at present. As I listened to these positive affirmations, I was stupefied and could say nothing. I see you doubt my word, said my uncle. Follow me. I obeyed mechanically. Leaving the presbytery, the professor took a road through an opening in the basaltic rock, which led far away from the sea. We were soon in open country, if we could give such a name to a place all covered with volcanic deposits. The whole land seemed crushed under the weight of enormous stones, of trap, of basalt, of granite, of lava, and of all other volcanic substances. I could see many spouts of steam rising in the air. These white vapors, called in the Icelandic language reykir, come from hot water fountains and indicate by their violence the volcanic activity of the soil. Now, the sight of these appeared to justify my apprehension. I was therefore all the more surprised and mortified when my uncle thus addressed me. You see all this smoke, Harry, my boy? Yes, sir. Well, as long as you see them thus, you have nothing to fear from the volcano. How can that be? Be careful to remember this, continued the professor. At the approach of an eruption, these spouts of vapor redouble their activity to disappear altogether during the period of volcanic eruption. For the elastic fluids, no longer having the necessary tension, seek refuge in the interior of the crater instead of escaping through the fissures of the earth. If then the steam remains in its normal or habitual state, if their energy does not increase, and if you add to this the remark that the wind is not replaced by heavy atmospheric pressure and dead calm, you may be quite sure that there is no fear of any immediate eruption. But enough, my boy. When science has sent forth her fiat, it is only to hear and obey. I came back to the house quite downcast and disappointed. My uncle had completely defeated me with his scientific arguments. Nevertheless, I had still one hope, and that was when once we were at the bottom of the crater, that it would be impossible in default of a gallery or tunnel to descend any deeper. And this, despite all the learned Saknussims in the world. I passed the whole of the following night with a nightmare on my chest, and after unheard of miseries and tortures, found myself in the very depths of the earth, from which I was suddenly launched into planetary space under the form of an eruptive rock. Next day, June 23rd, Hans calmly awaited us outside the presbytery with his three companions loaded with provisions, tools, and instruments. Two iron shod poles, two guns, and two large game bags were reserved for my uncle and myself. Hans, who was a man who never forgot even the minutest precautions, he had added to our baggage a large skin full of water as an addition to our gourds. This assured us water for 8 days. It was 9 o'clock in the morning when we were quite ready. The rector and his huge wife, or servant, I never knew which, stood at the door to see us off. They appeared to be about to inflict on us the usual final kiss of the Icelanders. To our supreme astonishment, their adieu took the shape of a formidable bill, in which they even counted the use of the pastoral house. Really and truly the most abominable and dirty place I ever was in. The worthy couple cheated and robbed us like a Swiss innkeeper, and made us feel by the sum we had to pay the splendors of their hospitality. My uncle, however, paid without bargaining. A man who had made up his mind to undertake a voyage into the interior of the earth is not a man to haggle over a few miserable rix dollars. This important matter settled, Hans gave the signal for departure, and some few moments later, we had left Stapi. Chapter 12. The Ascent of Mount Sneffels. The huge volcano, which was the first stage of our daring experiment, is about 5,000 feet high. Sneffels is the termination of a long range of volcanic mountains, of a different character to the system of the island itself. One of its peculiarities is its two huge pointed summits. From whence we started, it was impossible to make out the real outlines of the peak against the gray field of sky. All we could distinguish was a vast dome of white which fell downwards from the head of the giant. The commencement of the great undertaking filled me with awe. Now that we had actually started, I began to believe in the reality of the undertaking. Our party formed quite a procession. We walked in a single file, preceded by Hans, the imperturbable eider duck hunter. He calmly led us by narrow paths where two persons could by no possibility walk abreast. Conversation was wholly impossible. We had all the more opportunity to reflect and admire the awful grandeur of the scene around. Beyond the extraordinary basaltic wall of the fjord of Stapi, we found ourselves making our way through fibrous turf, over which grew a scanty vegetation of grass, the residuum of the ancient vegetation of the swampy peninsula. The vast mass of this combustible, the field of which as yet is utterly unexplored, would suffice to warm Iceland for a whole century. This mighty turf pit, measured from the bottom of certain ravines, is often no less than 70 feet deep, and presents to the eye the view of successive layers of black, burnt up rock detritus separated by thin streaks of porous sandstone. The grandeur of the spectacle was undoubted, as well as its arid and deserted air. As a true nephew of the great Professor Hardwigg, and despite my preoccupation and doleful fears of what was to come, I observed with great interest the vast collection of mineralogical curiosities spread out before me in this vast museum of natural history. Looking back to my recent studies, I went over in thought the whole geological history of Iceland. This extraordinary and curious island must have made its appearance from out of the world of waters at a comparatively recent date. Like the coral islands of the Pacific, it may, for aught we know, be still rising by slow and imperceptible degrees. If this really be the case, its origin can be attributed to only one cause, that of the continued action of subterranean fires. This was a happy thought. If so, if this were true, away with the theories of Sir Humphrey Davy. Away with the authority of the parchment of Arne Saknussemm, the wonderful pretensions to discovery on the part of my uncle, and to our journey. All must end in smoke. Charmed with the idea, I began more carefully to look about me. A serious study of the soil was necessary to negative or confirm my hypothesis. I took in every item of what I saw, and I began to comprehend the succession of phenomena which had preceded its formation. Iceland, being absolutely without sedimentary soil, is composed exclusively of volcanic tufa, that is to say, of an agglomeration of stone and of rocks of porous texture. Long before the existence of volcanoes, it was composed of a solid body of massive trap rock lifted bodily and slowly out of the sea by the action of the centrifugal force at work in the earth. The internal fires, however, had not as yet burst their bounds and flooded the exterior cake of Mother Earth with hot and raging lava. My readers must excuse this brief and somewhat pedantic geological lecture, but it is necessary to the complete understanding of what follows. At a later period in the world's history, a huge and mighty fissures must, reasonably by analogy, have been dug diagonally from the southwest to the northeast of the island, through which by degrees flowed the volcanic crust. The great and wondrous phenomenon then went on without violence. The outpouring was enormous, and the seething fused matter, ejected from the bowels of the earth, spread slowly and peacefully in the form of vast level plains, or what are called mamelons or mounds. It was at this epoch that the rocks called feldspars, cyanides, and porphyries appeared. But as a natural consequence of this overflow, the depth of the island increased. It can readily be believed that what an enormous quantity of elastic fluids were piled up within its center, when at last it afforded no other openings after the process of cooling the crust had taken place. At length, a time came when, despite the enormous thickness and weight of the upper crust, the mechanical forces of the combustible gases below became so great that they actually upheaved the weighty back and made for themselves a huge and gigantic shafts. Hence the volcanoes which suddenly arose through the upper crust, and next the craters which burst forth at the summit of these new creations. It will be seen that the first phenomena in connection with the formation of the island were simply eruptive. To these, however, shortly succeeded the volcanic phenomena. Through the newly formed openings escaped the marvelous mass of basaltic stones, with which the plain we were now crossing was covered. We were trampling our way over heavy rocks of dark gray color, which, while cooling, had been molded into six-sided prisms. In the back distance, we could see a number of flattened cones, which formerly were so many fire vomiting mouths. After the basaltic eruption was appeased and set at rest, the volcano, the force of which increased with that of the extinct craters, gave free passage to the fiery overflow of lava and to the mass of cinders and pumice stone now scattered over the sides of the mountain, like disheveled hair on the shoulders of a bashante. Here, in a nutshell, I had the whole history of the phenomena from which Iceland arose. All take their rise in the fierce action of interior fires, and to believe that the central mass did not remain in a state of liquid fire, white hot, was simply and purely madness. This being satisfactorily proved, QED, what insensate folly to pretend to penetrate into the interior of the mighty earth. This mental lecture delivered to myself while proceeding on a journey did me good. I was quite reassured as to the fate of our enterprise, and therefore went, like a brave soldier, mounting a bristling battery to the assault of old Sneffels. As we advanced, the road became every moment more difficult. The soil was broken and dangerous. The rocks broke and gave way under our feet, and we had to be scrupulously careful in order to avoid dangerous and constant falls. Hans advanced as calmly as if he had been walking over Salisbury Plain. Sometimes he would disappear behind huge blocks of stone, and we momentarily lost sight of him. There was a little period of anxiety, and then there was a shrill whistle, just to tell us where to look for him. Occasionally, he would take it into his head to stop to pick up lumps of rock and silently pile them up into small heaps in order that we might not lose our way on our return. He had no idea of the journey we were about to undertake. At all events, the precaution was a good one, though how utterly useless and unnecessary, but I must not anticipate. 3 hours of terrible fatigue, walking incessantly, had only brought us to the foot of the great mountain. This will give some notion of what we had still to undergo. Suddenly, however, Hans cried a halt. That is, he made signs to that effect, and a summary kind of breakfast was laid out on the lava before us. My uncle, who now was simply Professor Hardwigg, was so eager to advance that he bolted his food like a greedy clown. This halt for refreshment was also a halt for repose. The professor was therefore compelled to wait the good pleasure of his imperturbable guide, who did not give the signal for departure for a good hour. The three Icelanders, who were as taciturn as their comrade, did not say a word, but went on eating and drinking very quietly and soberly. From this, our first real stage, we began to ascend the slopes of the Sneffels volcano. Its magnificent snowy nightcap, as we began to call it, by an optical delusion very common in mountains, appeared to me to be close at hand, and yet how many long, weary hours must elapse before we reached its summit. That unheard of fatigue must we endure. The stones on the mountain side, held together by no cement of soil, bound together by no roots or creeping herbs, gave way continually under our feet and went rushing below into the plains like a series of small avalanches. In certain places, the sides of this stupendous mountain were at an angle so steep that it was impossible to climb upwards, and we were compelled to get round these obstacles as best we might. Those who understand alpine climbing will comprehend our difficulties. Often we were obliged to help each other along by means of our climbing poles. I must say this for my uncle, that he stuck as close to me as possible. He never lost sight of me, and on many occasions his arm supplied me with firm and solid support. He was strong, wiry, and apparently insensible to fatigue. Another great advantage with him was that he had the innate sentiment of equilibrium, for he never slipped or failed in his steps. The Icelanders, though heavily loaded, climbed with the agility of mountaineers. Looking up every now and then at the height of the great volcano of Sneffels, it appeared to me wholly impossible to reach to the summit on that side. At all events, if the angle of inclination did not speedily change. Fortunately, after an hour of unheard of fatigues, and of gymnastic exercises that would have been trying to an acrobat, we came to a vast field of ice, which wholly surrounded the bottom of the cone of the volcano. The natives called it tablecloth, probably from some such reason as the dwellers in the Cape of Good Hope called their mountain Table Mountain and their roads Table Bay. Such as it was, it served us admirably. The abrupt character of the slopes momentarily increased, but these remarkable stone steps, a little less difficult than those of the Egyptian pyramids, were the one simple natural means by which we were enabled to proceed. About 7 in the evening of that day, after having clambered up 2,000 of these rough steps, we found ourselves overlooking a kind of spur or projection of the mountain, a sort of buttress upon which the cone like crater, properly so called, leaned for support. The ocean lay beneath us at a depth of more than 3,200 feet, a grand and mighty spectacle. We had reached the region of eternal snows. The cold was keen, searching, and intense. The wind blew with extraordinary violence. I was utterly exhausted. My worthy uncle, the professor, saw clearly that my legs refused further service, and that, in fact, I was utterly exhausted. Despite his hot and feverish impatience, he decided, with a sigh, upon a halt. He called the eider duck hunter to his side. That worthy, however, shook his head. Ovan four, was his sole spoken reply. It appears, says my uncle with a woe begone look, that we must go higher. He then turned to Hans and asked him to give some reason for this decisive response. Mister, replied the guide. Ja, mister. Yes, the mister, cried one of the Icelandic guides in a terrified tone. It was the first time he had spoken. What does this mysterious word signify? I anxiously inquired. Look, said my uncle. I looked down upon the plain below, and I saw a prodigious volume of pulverized pumice stone, of sand, of dust, rising to the heavens in the form of a mighty waterspout. It resembled the fearful phenomenon of a similar character known to the travelers in the desert of the Great Sahara. The wind was driving it directly towards that side of Sneffels on which we were perched. This opaque veil standing up between us and the sun projected a deep shadow on the flanks of the mountain. If this sand spout broke over us, we must all be infallibly destroyed, crushed in its fearful embraces. This extraordinary phenomenon were common when the wind shakes the glaciers and sweeps over the arid plains, is in the Icelandic tongue called mistor. Hastigd! Hastigd! cried our guide. Now, I certainly knew nothing of Danish, but I thoroughly understood that his gestures were meant to quicken us. The guide turned rapidly in a direction which would take us to the back of the crater, all the while ascending slightly. We followed rapidly, despite our excessive fatigue. A quarter of an hour later, Hans paused to enable us to look back. The mighty whirlwind of sand was spreading up the slope of the mountain to the very spot where we had proposed to halt. Huge stones were caught up, cast into the air, and thrown about as during an eruption. We were happily a little out of the direction of the wind, and therefore out of reach of danger. But for the precaution and knowledge of our guide, our dislocated bodies, our crushed and broken limbs, would have been cast to the wind, like dust from some unknown meteor. Hans, however, did not think it prudent to pass the night on the bare side of the cone. We therefore continued our journey in a zigzag direction. The 1,500 feet which remained to be accomplished took us at least 5 hours. The turnings and windings, the no thoroughfares, the marches and marches turned that insignificant distance into at least 3 leagues. I never felt such misery, fatigue, and exhaustion in my life. I was ready to faint from hunger and cold. The rarefied air at the same time painfully acted upon my lungs. At last, when I thought myself at my last gasp about 11 at night, it being in that region quite dark, we reached the summit of Mount Sneffels. It was in an awful mood of mind that, despite my fatigue, before I descended into the crater which was to shelter us for the night, I paused to behold the sunrise at midnight on the very day of its lowest declension, and enjoyed the spectacle of its ghastly pale rays cast upon the isle which lay sleeping at our feet. I no longer wondered at people traveling all the way from England to Norway to behold this magical and wondrous spectacle.